Good evening, everybody. I hope you are doing well. I hope that you have been enjoying the weather outside. It has been gorgeous the last few days, minus the wind about blowing me away and everything like that. It has been good. The kids are doing their sports right now, and so we're spending the evenings outside. So, it's just... God is good, amen. So this evening we're going to be jumping off again into chapter 3. Tonight we're going to be, don't get intimidated, but we're going to be looking at the rest of chapter 3. That is verses 8 all the way through, I believe it's verse 30 there, if I'm not mistaken. But nevertheless, as we're discussing this part of it this evening, we're going to be discussing a little bit of the fiery furnace. I feel like it's something that I'll probably pick out a few things for us to discuss, but ultimately, we're going to kind of jump over a lot of that because I kind of even already preached on that at the beginning of the year, and so just to kind of get us through, that sounds awful, but get us to the last part of chapter 3 there, verses 26 through 30. Is where I want to spend a lot of our time this evening, but I do want to read through these verses just that way we can kind of keep in with the context of what is happening and going on. And so right now, of course, there's been a decree that everybody is to bow down to worship the image that Nebuchadnezzar has created, as we discussed last week in verses 1 through 7 there of chapter 3. So just a little bit of a recap. This image has been erected that is pure gold, or overlaid in gold and everything else. Everybody's to come and bow down and to worship it whenever the harp and the lyre and the flute and the stringed instruments, all that begin to play. And so we're going to follow up on that side of it as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego decide we are not going to bow down to anything. So with that being the case, we'll jump off into chapter 3, verse 8 here. It says, "Some Chaldeans, that is the Babylonians, took this occasion to come forward and maliciously accuse the Jews. And they said to King Nebuchadnezzar, 'May the king live forever. You as king have issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, the zither, lyre, harp, and drum, and every kind of music must fall down and worship the gold statue. And whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. And there are some Jews who have appointed to manage the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these men have ignored you, the king, and they do not serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up.' Then, in a furious rage, Nebuchadnezzar gave orders to bring in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar asked them, 'Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is it true that you don't serve my gods or worship the gold statue I have set up? Now, if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, drum, and every kind of music instrument, or kind of music, fall down and worship the statue I made. But if you don't worship it, you will immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God who can rescue you from my power?' So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king Nebuchadnezzar, 'We don't need to give you an answer to this question. If the God we serve exists, then he can rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he can rescue us from the power of you, the king. But even if he does not rescue us, we want you as a king to know that we will not serve your gods or worship the gold statue you set up.'" So there again, verses 8 through 18, as you can see on the screen there, they're pretty self-explanatory. We know what's happening and going on. They were commanded to bow down, and they didn't, which ultimately I would pose the other side of it of, what would you do? What would you do if you found yourself in their circumstances? Are we at that place in our current context of government and world within America? I don't think so. But if it were to come to that, push comes to shove, would you be the one to stand up and say, "I ain't going to do this. Greater is me, or he who is in me, than he who is in the world. This is my stance. This is what I'm doing. This is what I'm going to live and stand and abide within." And I love it out of the last part of verses 16 through 18 there. It's that even if statement, I would say our statement of the year. God, we expect you. We want you to move on our behalf. But even if you don't, it'll be okay. No matter where we're at, no matter what we're doing, we have to keep in mind, the centrality of what is taking on and what is going on right now in these moments as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are being faced with this life or death situation. I mean, that's literally it. They're choosing decision, or they're making decisions right now based on their lives. That is, being dead, killed, murdered, whatever. I mean, that's a lot of just to weigh on an individual. To consider, to think through. It's just that's a lot to take in. But nevertheless, as we go on, I want us to look at verses 19 through 25 real quick. It says, Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with rage, and the expression on his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he gave orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than was customary. And he commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. So these men, in their trousers, robes, head coverings, and other clothes, were tied up and thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. And since the king's command was so urgent and the furnace extremely hot, the raging flames killed those men who carried Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego up. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the furnace of blazing fire. Then the king Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in alarm, and he said to his advisors, Didn't we throw 3 men bound into the fire? And they replied, Yes, of course, your majesty, they replied to the king. He exclaimed, Look, I see 4 men, not tied, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. So in verses 19 through 25, just to kind of pick a few things out here, 7 times hotter than what it normally was. I mean, they would have added a lot of extra flammable material. I mean, construction remnants of building the statue, whatever the case is. And so, I mean, think about the severity of this moment, that especially for these 3 guys of, hey, just to incentivize you to, come to your senses almost. It's not just going to be a blazing fire. We're going to make it so hot that literally, as the guards were carrying Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego up, literally they died in the process. I mean, just something to think through and just something to consider. I mean, you're talking, it takes roughly about 450 degrees to singe hair off of our heads, eyebrows, things like that. But I mean, you're talking this fire, it was potentially well over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, that's hot. I mean, that's a lot to consider in terms of these very moments. But, in verse 21, it talks about their clothing, would have caught fire quickly. It would have been a fast and painful death, given the extremeness of how hot this fire was burning. So, it was so hot there in verse 22 that it killed the men who brought the boys up to it. In verse 23, more than likely, whenever we start talking about the furnace itself, there's the possibility it was built in almost into the side of the hillside or something like that. But in essence, think of it kind of like a dome. You would have had a top entryway to where you could have walked up, for instance, like a hillside or something like that, and there would have been an opening in the very top of it for the fire to escape. Of course, if you know anything about fire, in order to get a fire, you have to have oxygen. So it has to have the ability to breathe, like life or anything else. So there would have been a hole or a door, some kind of opening up at the top. But more than likely, if you're thinking about it potentially being in a hillside, there would have been a door or something that would have allowed basically Nebuchadnezzar, whoever, to look into this fire at this moment. And so this is what it's talking about. They were brought up, and then in verse 25, whenever it talks, and they fell in kind of thing. It would have been that they would have been put up and then just dropped down into the fire. But imagine at the very top of that opening how hot you could feel the flames. You could feel the heat coming out of that. And in verse 25, clearly God was with him and made his presence known. There's no way to come to another conclusion. There's no way to come to a different outcome. This is nothing more than the movement and the miracle of God Himself and divine intervention. That's what makes this story so wonderful, so powerful, is thinking through how God protected these boys from literally being melted. Or, as you think about cremation, literally they would have been cremated right there before everybody. It was a public spectacle. And yet, God had His hand on him. So, let's jump off into verses 26 through 30, because this is kind of where I want us to think about what I want us to think about for a minute. It says in verse 26 there, Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire and called Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, "You servants of the Most High God," I love that, "come out." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. When the satraps, prefects, governors, and the king's advisors gathered around, they saw that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men. Not a hair of their heads was singed, their robes were unaffected, and there was no smell of fire on them. And then Nebuchadnezzar exclaimed, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent His angel and rescued His servants who trusted in Him. They violated the king's command and risked their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. And therefore I issue a decree that anyone of any people, nation, or language who says anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be torn limb from limb and his house made a garbage dump. For there is no other God who is able to deliver like this." Then the king rewarded Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So, in verses 26 through 30, here's my question, okay? Had the Babylonians seen anything like this ever before? No. There again, considering who they are, they're not interacting with Yahweh. They're not interacting with the God who is able, the great I Am that we learn out of Exodus chapter 3. There's a possibility they've heard of things like this, but had they more than likely experienced any kind of miracle to this degree ever before? No, not really. But consider there again what we've already discussed in chapters 1 and 2. You're thinking about the food intake of chapter 1 whenever these boys decide we're going to be on a different diet than what the other 14 to 16-year-old boys were. We learned that in terms of chapter 1 there, they came out the other side and they were actually healthier. They were stronger because of their diet. So they had won over, more in a physical sense at that point, some of the governors and the guards and different things like that. But even in terms of chapter 2, as we discussed the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had and the parameters or limitations that Nebuchadnezzar had put on it of, I'm not going to tell anybody, you've got to speak this towards me. And yet Daniel comes through, to which even in chapter 2 we learn that Nebuchadnezzar said there's something different about Daniel's God, Yahweh. Now we're seeing in chapter 3 another example. So it's almost like there's this escalation of events of where it's like, by the time we get to chapter 3, there's got to be some kind of light bulb going off. We're establishing a baseline, a consistent pattern that God is moving on these boys' behalf. So, obviously, they defied the king's order and it worked out. Nebuchadnezzar could have made this decree because he was intimidated by what God could do to him. So if you think about in verses 29 and 30 there, as it's talking about how Nebuchadnezzar says this is the God, the Most High God, this is their God, and you are to worship Him, you are to surrender to them. In essence, what I'm saying here is Nebuchadnezzar could have looked at the moment and said, I've backed the wrong horse, I've made the wrong decision. Yahweh, don't strike me down, I'm innocent. But we're going to serve you now. There again, they're polytheistic. They believe in many gods. This wouldn't have been an uncommon thing or a revelatory thing for Nebuchadnezzar to do. There again, it's kind of, he's saving his own life in a roundabout way, potentially, to where he's saying like, okay, God, you've proven it. There's something there. We're going to worship you. So, more or less, that's what Nebuchadnezzar could be kind of speaking out of here as we're thinking through these verses. I love this quote from Origen in the 2nd century on into the 3rd century there. He was considered one of the patristic fathers or early church fathers of the early church, that is, after the New Testament had kind of closed out there. But he remarked that without such wonders, the apostles would not have persuaded those who heard new doctrines and new teachings to leave their traditional religion and to accept the apostles' teaching at the risk of their lives. So, I mean, in essence, what Origen is saying, what benefited Paul was the fact that there were Old Testament stories. There again, considering what we're thinking through of the New Testament, you're talking Judaism, you're talking a very foundational Bible stories. They're going to know Abraham, they're going to know about Isaac, they're going to know about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel in the lion's den. They're going to have all of these stories kind of etched and burned into the back of their minds right now, and yet Origen is talking about it in such a way that if it wasn't for those miracles of God, the New Testament wouldn't have stood a chance, as far as people would have been a little bit more reticent to believe in who God was and the power, the ability, the redemption, the miracles, all these things that God could provide. In essence, Origen was saying God paved a way. He made it possible for them to be able to get to the other side. And that's what Paul would have used, or how he would have I don't want to say enticed, but how he would have shared in that testimony of, this is the God who we serve. You know about him then, but imagine what he can do now, so much as Origen expresses. It came with the teaching at the risk of their own life. Remember in Acts chapter 7, the stoning of Stephen? You talk about Paul before he was converted on the road to Damascus. He was, a persecutor of the way, that is the church. That was the goal, to destroy it. I mean, and yet you had people that were looking and saying, wait a minute, hold on. There's some substance to this. There's something about these moments that we can rely upon. And so I find that incredible. Just there again, kind of these thoughts from Origen. But just even more so, kind of thinking into the depth of what Scripture relays, or what we can find through the course of history. Mattathias encouraged his sons through Antiochus IV by using this passage. So in essence, in 1 Maccabees, you have, and we'll get to all this later on. We're to be determined to eventually discuss on into the future, but we'll get into this a little bit more in depth then. But Antiochus IV was a ruler over the nations and everything whenever you think of the intertestamental period. But in essence, Daniel, as we get into chapter 7 and I believe chapter 5, if I'm not mistaken, but nevertheless, as we think about what it means for Antiochus IV, there was going to come a time to where the Jewish people would face extreme persecution. And so that came under the man by the name of Antiochus IV. I mean, literally thinking of, I would say, is probably in essence like the first Holocaust. We have the one in the 40s under Hitler, but yet I would say this was the first one. Antiochus was an awful individual, but whenever it came to Mattathias, how he expressed it was to say, it's time for us to stand up. If you've heard of the Maccabean revolt, this is kind of what it surrounds around. This is them saying, okay, we have to stand up and go against what is happening and going on from a governmental dictatorship, everything else. We've got to stand up and we've got to fight. So there's the Maccabean revolt that occurs and takes place, to which they're going up against, awful and wicked, evil people, and to which this is the story he basically uses, is to say, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whenever they were faced into the fiery furnace, God, even if you save us, we're going to praise you, but even if you don't, we're still okay. That's pretty powerful, how even throughout the ages people have used the passage here in Daniel 3 to express, like, it doesn't matter. God, you will be faithful one way or another. Even over into the book of Hebrews chapter 11 verse 34, a lot of people know this as the hall of faith. That is that the author of Hebrew goes through and he references a lot of heroes of the faith. And wouldn't you know it, in verse 34, this is a reference going back to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Quenched the violence of the fire, escaped the edge of the sword. Out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, and turned to flight the armies of the aliens. And so even in the Hall of Faith, that wonderful chapter found in Hebrews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego go down in the history books as people that had, and I would say went above and beyond, I don't want to say the call of duty, but just the call of faith of saying, God, this is what it is. Like, we're about to die or you're going to save us. Like, there's no gray area. It's one or the other, either or. But either way, God, we're going to surrender to you. And so this evening, as we're thinking about this, just a couple of points of application. The very first thing is I was thinking through this passage and just how it all unfolded. I think sometimes we focus too much on the present rather than the future. Well, now, preacher, don't the Bible say to worry about or to focus on today because tomorrow has its own things? Yeah, there's a sense of temporalness that we have to be aware of. You know, it's not that God is saying don't plan, don't give vision, don't do this or that. We have to be aware of what God is doing in the moment, but sometimes I think we get caught up not necessarily on what God is doing in the moment, but what we are doing in the moment. You know, very easily, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego could have got caught up in the moment and said, well, I mean, isn't this how our minds work? Well, God, if we just bow down, maybe there's another time in a few months that we can make up for it, but at least we'll be alive to do so. You know, I feel like that's how we compromise with God. You know, I think back to, you know, whenever you think of Jacob and in the wilderness and everything else, and it talks about him wrestling with God. That's how he got the name, is because he wrestled with God. You know, oftentimes I feel like there's a lot of similarities between us because we wrestle with God quite a bit, and now we think, well, God, if I can just pass in this moment, I can live to fight another day. God, I will be a benefit to you this day, but this one, maybe not. And so unfortunately, I think oftentimes we stop and we say, God, the long term is good, but the here and now, we kind of intermingle those things to the place of where we say, okay, God, what matters right now, but we're not thinking, what's this going to do for people in eternity? What's this going to do for people a few months from now? If I compromise on my faith in this moment, who's to say that I won't compromise on my faith in a later day, in a few months? There again, I think, unfortunately, you know, we focus so much on the present of how to make it to the end that we forget our lives are automatically and already into the hands of the one who will see us to the end. You know, if that's the end of the day that God takes me up, okay, that's what happens. If it's 30, 40 years from now, okay, that's what happens. Yeah, I think it behooves us to stop and say, God, even in this moment, it's not about survivability. It's about you. It's not about impressing. It's not about being able to please or do anything else. It's okay, God, in this moment, because I'm surrendered to you, I know that you'll make a path forward. You know, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, it talks about, I believe it's in verse 13, you know, God has made a way of escape. That is contingent upon our faith in the moment, in the present, and just saying, God, even in this moment, we will be able to get to the future. Secondly, you know, if God can deliver these individuals from their tribulations, do our issues seem as trivial as what they're facing right there? I mean, does somebody have a knife to your head right now? Probably not. Does somebody, is there really anybody in your life that is saying, I absolutely hate your guts because of the fact that you believe in this man by the name of Jesus Christ? More than likely, no. I mean, if you stop and you think about what they're walking through versus what we're going through today, I mean, it's a cakewalk. Now, we'll just call it like it is. We do not experience, well, at least within the Western, you know, Christian, post-Christian world that we live in America right now, we still don't face deep criticism like this. You know, and yet in the moments to where faith really mattered and their faith could have been and was being shaken to its core, we don't experience things like that. But yet God protected them through that. It makes me stop and say, God, if you can do that, my issues should be a cakewalk. Like, God, I'm going to trust in you. I'm going to lean on you. I'm going to do what I can. But overall, do we have those same kind of ideologies? Do we carry the same kind of faith that, okay, yeah, it may be, even within the last little bit, I'll say even the last few years, the amount of people that have looked at me and said, I don't like you, I hate you, I think you're not good, or this or that, or you're not even a Christian. I mean, I've been told all kinds of things as a pastor. You run into it. But has it ever made me stop and look and say, okay, God, it's not worth it? Nah, people will be people. But that's what I'm called to do, is live my life for Christ. No matter the trivialness of what I may be walking through, it's nothing in comparison to saying my life is in jeopardy and I'm being thrown into a fire in a few minutes and, God, I need you to move right now. What issues are you potentially walking through that they feel so heavy, they feel so weighty, but yet it's probably nothing for God to do with, God to take care of. I mean, if God's working in this, I'd say this one, what we face, is probably a whole lot easier to deal with. But it's something to consider. Do we trust that God is going to move in our lives like He did for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? I hope this has gave you a few things to think on and some thoughts to consider. But I love y'all. I hope y'all have a wonderful rest of your week and continue to enjoy the freshness and the springing up of life that is occurring outside in God's creation right now. And just may we revel in it and know that God has blessed us beyond measure. But I guess for that, we'll see y'all next week, and I guess we'll go from there. Thank you, guys.